Now that you've learned the basics of risk identification, this video will help you see that it's not always quite that easy. We began with the simple equation in the title here. Risk equals consequence times probability. I've stressed that this is not a literal equation for calculating risks, but be forewarned, some people say that it is, and those who do usually find it inadequate to the task. As we approach risk, there's a trigger of some sort and a harm that ultimately occurs, which we must identify. This is the consequence of our equation. The entire sequence of events required to progress from the trigger to the harm constitutes what we call the probability in our equation. Risk assessment estimates the probability of that sequence of events that's necessary to cause the harm of concern. And there is uncertainty about the trigger, the consequence, the sequence of events, and the overall probability of those events occurring. You will find many definitions that want to make the definition of risk more granular. Our understanding of risk can indeed be broken down into more component parts. This graphic illustrates risk for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers National Levee Safety Program, and it provides an excellent example of this granularity. Notice on the right-hand side that risk is defined essentially as we've defined it, to consider the consequences and their probability. On the left, this definition is broken down into 5 components. Hazard is the thing that can cause harm. The figure shows it to be a flood flow. The performance of the levee system is the second concern. Will it perform as designed? Will it fail in some fashion, or perhaps be overtopped? Exposure refers to the people and property assets that may be harmed by a flood that results when a levee cannot provide the desired protection. Vulnerability is a measure of the people and property's susceptibility to harm from the flood. Consequences characterize that harm. Whether you use the expanded version of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or the simple version of this course, bear in mind that both are trying to tell a coherent story about how a trigger event results in harm under conditions of sometimes great uncertainty. Risk management has become such a sophisticated process that it seems that identifying risks ought to be the easiest part of the process. It is not. There's a great deal of confusion about the process because the types of events are all completely interchangeable depending on the perspective taken in the decision problem. One person's trigger is another person's hazard, and that is another person's consequence. There may be multiple triggers. There may be multiple hazards. There can be one or more consequences of concern. There may be multiple paths from triggers to consequences. There will be considerable uncertainty, and there can be multiple risk management measures in place. Let's consider a risk from an engineer's perspective. The trigger is an earthquake. The hazard is seen as a core wall collapse, and the consequence is a dam breach. All of these components together, and the details of the story of how the earthquake leads to the dam breach, comprises the risk. Now let's take an emergency response perspective. This time the trigger is the dam breach, the hazard is the resulting flood, and the consequences of concern are the potential losses of life. All of these components together and the details of the story of how the dam breach can lead to the loss of life is the risk. The floodplain resident whose life is not at risk has yet another perspective. The trigger is the flood, the hazard would be floodwaters inundating his house, and the consequence would be the loss of the house to live in. All of these components together, as well as the details of the story of how the flood causes the loss of the use of the house, comprise the risk. Counsel for a flood district has a very different perspective. The trigger is the flood, and the hazard is the loss of life. The consequence of concern, however, is the lawsuit that could result. All these components together, as well as the detail of the story of how the flood causes a lawsuit, would comprise the risk. Is it any wonder that identifying a risk can be so challenging? There are so many perspectives that can be taken. It's critically important that effective risk managers identify the risks relevant to the affected stakeholders. This requires good science, effective risk communication, and ethical risk governance. Risk management measures like dams can become triggers and hazards. Risk identification depends on one's perspective. It's absolutely critical to develop and vet a clear perspective for risk management.